Hey, are you ready for a discussion on the periods and movements in literature? We'll go over the entire history of literature through the various periods and the movements. Okay. First, about Greco-Roman Classicism. Greco-Roman Classicism started in the BCs. And first, there was classical period in Greece. After that, classical period in Rome. What is classicism? Classicism is an aesthetic attitude dependent on principles based in the culture, art, and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. I will explain. Classicism is an aesthetic attitude, it's an aesthetic movement. What is it based on? The principles of culture, art, and literature of ancient Greece and Rome, starting from the 6th century BC to the 1st century AD. What did classicism emphasize? It emphasized form, simplicity, proportion, clarity of structure, perfection. What does all that mean? Classicism emphasizes on form. Classicism gave importance to meter, to stanza, to formal structures. Classicism also believed that literature should be very simple. The form should be very ordered and complicated, but literature itself should be simple. It should have proportion. It should follow the rules and it should have proportion, clarity of structure, perfection. Romanticism is even more complicated because of self-expression of the author. But classicism focuses on clarity of structure, perfection, restrained emotion. Emotion should not be let loose. Instead, intellect is what is important. That is what classicists believed. The Greek classical period is called the Golden Age of Greece. It was the time when the city-states or polises came into being, early democracy came into being. Athens was the most important city-state, and there developed art, poetry, architecture, drama, philosophy. All these disciplines, contemporary disciplines, originated in classical Greece. And classical Greece was the period of Aesop, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, Socrates, Aeschylus, all these people. You know that, right? What about Roman period? Roman period came after the Greek classical period. Greece declined politically and Rome began to rule Greece. That is when Roman classicism began. Roman classicism was modeled on Greek classicism. Roman classicism was the result of Romans copying Greek classicism. After Rome conquered Greece, Romans copied Greek classicism. Did you understand? At this time, Roman Republic gave way to Roman Empire. Julius Caesar died and there was civil war, and Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar had come into being. And this was the time when Rome also established its empire. The Roman Empire was also founded. This is the time when Virgil, Horace, Ovid, etc. were important writers. Lucretius, Cicero, these were all very important writers in Rome. So I have given some major figures here. Of the Greco-Roman classicism, major figures are Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. All three of them were tragedians. Then Aristophanes was the comedy writer. Then Plato and Aristotle were philosophers. Pindar was lyric poet. All of them were in Greece. What about Rome? There was Virgil, who wrote Aeneid, Horace and Ovid. Now tell me, what did all these people write? Aeschylus wrote the Orestia, which includes Agamemnon, libation bearers, and Eumenides. Three plays. It's a trilogy, the Orestia trilogy. Then there is Sophocles. Sophocles gave importance to, Sophocles wrote the Theban trilogy. Euripides wrote Medea. Plato wrote Republic. Aristotle wrote Poetics. Pindar wrote Odes. Virgil wrote Aeneid. Horace wrote satires and odes, and Ovid wrote Metamorphoses. I suppose you got that, all of you. So this is about Greco-Roman Classicism. Shall we move on? Then there is Renaissance. Wait a minute. Did I make a mistake? Drang. No. Sorry. Renaissance. The Renaissance period is starting from the 14th century itself, but actually high Renaissance is 16th to 17th century. So starting from the 14th, 15th centuries, we see that we usually say that in England, Chaucer is the first Renaissance writer. Chaucer lived in the 14th century. And the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 85. It ended with the Tudor dynasty being established. Tudor dynasty is the first period in Renaissance. At the end of the Tudor dynasty came Jacobean period. After that came, at the end of the Tudor dynasty, Elizabethan period. After that, Jacobean period. Then Caroline period, the period of Charles I. Then Puritan interregnum, or the period of Oliver Cromwell's Lord Protectorship. All this is within Renaissance. If you are confused, I'll say that again. Renaissance means early Tudor period, that is starting from 1485, when the Wars of the Roses ended. After that, there is Elizabethan period. End of the Tudor period is Elizabethan period. After that, Jacobean period, that is Stuart dynasty. After that, Caroline period, that is the period of Charles I. After that, Commonwealth or Puritan interregnum, the period of Oliver Cromwell. So after that, Restoration came in 1660, restoration of monarchy. All this is Renaissance. Renaissance is the period of European cultural, artistic, political and economic rebirth. During this time in the Renaissance, there was throughout Europe artistic, cultural, political and economic rebirth. Following the Middle Ages. The medieval period came before this. The medieval period is starting from Norman conquest to Renaissance. In the medieval period, the church was very predominant. Latin and French were important languages. But in the Renaissance period, English became the major language in England, literary language in England. In the Renaissance period, vernacular or spoken languages became prominent. And the Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature and art. Literature was reborn in this time, in the Renaissance period. And the Tudor period was a time of great, flowering of literature. It was the golden age, especially the Elizabethan period was the golden age of literature. Now, the major figures I have written from across Europe. Lorenzo de' Medici was a major patron in Italy. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo and Copernicus, Petrarch, they were all major Italians. Raphael, some of them were scientists like Copernicus and Galileo. Others were artists. Montaigne, Machiavelli, they were writers. William Shakespeare, university wits. Ben Jonson, John Donne, they were all writers of the Renaissance. John Milton is regarded as the last of the Renaissance writers. Did you get that? Okay, shall we move on? The English Civil War period. The Civil War is Puritan interregnum. It comes within the Renaissance period actually. And what happened was, in the 17th century, there was the Civil War between the Puritans on the one hand and the Royalists on the other. The Puritans were called Roundheads, the Royalists were called Cavaliers. And in the Civil War, Charles I was beheaded. King Charles I was beheaded. And Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector of England. There was no king at this time. And after the Puritan interregnum, Puritan rule, there was the restoration of monarchy. Did you understand? Now, English Civil War period is a series of civil wars between parliamentarians or the Roundheads, they are the Puritans, and the Royalists, they are the Cavaliers. This led to regicide. Regicide means death of the king, murder of the king. And there was the Puritan interregnum under the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was the was the great grand nephew of Thomas Cromwell, who was a very major figure during the Reformation. In the Renaissance period, there were two major events. One was humanism, the other was Reformation. The English Civil War was the result of Reformation. In the Reformation, Catholic Church was replaced by the Anglican Church in England. Anglican Church is a part of the Protestant Church. Did you get that? Now, the major writers of the English Civil War period are John Milton, Jeremy Taylor, he was Milton's adversary or enemy, and Thomas Browne. What did John Milton write? John Milton wrote Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. These are the main works of Milton. He has also written early works like L'Allegro and Il Penseroso. He has also written Lycidas. Jeremy Taylor wrote Holy Living and Holy Dying. Thomas Browne wrote Religio Medici, Urn Burial. Then the Cavalier poets. The Cavalier poets lived from the 1640s to 50s. Only for a short while, they were the supporters of English King Charles I. 17th century English royalist poets. They wrote primarily about courtly love, and they wrote in a very easy mellifluous style. Very easy style, using stock images, etc., musicality, etc. They were all inspired by Ben Jonson. That's why they were called Sons of Ben. The Cavalier poets were unlike the metaphysical poets. Metaphysical poets wrote very disturbing poetry, cerebral poetry, but Cavalier poets wrote easy, smooth poetry. They wrote lyric poems, mostly, small lyrics, but not sonnets, just plain lyrics. They celebrated courtly themes of beauty, love, nature, sensuality, drinking, good fellowship or friendship, honor, and social life. In many ways, this poetry embodies the attitude called carpe diem or seize the day. That is common to metaphysical poets also. The Cavalier poets worshipped the king, the monarch, and they used Platonic love in their poetry. Clear? The important figures are Richard Lovelace, John Suckling, then William Davenant. Robert Herrick and Thomas Carew were also metaphysical poets. They wrote both Cavalier poetry and metaphysical poetry. Then there was Edmund Waller. Then the metaphysical poets. They also wrote in the mid-19th century. Some of them lived in early 17th century, not 19th, 17th. Some of them lived in the early 17th century itself, like George Herbert, etc. It was a 17th century English movement that used extended conceit, and it was mostly about religion, but they also wrote about love, metaphysical poetry. Their poems were highly intellectualized. Unlike Elizabethan poetry, their poems were highly intellectualized. And metaphysical poets used rather strange imagery. They drew their images from chemistry, astronomy, all sorts of sciences. And they used frequent paradoxes. Metaphysical poetry used frequent paradoxes. That is called metaphysical conceits also. They employed far-fetched images called metaphysical conceits. And they contained extremely complicated thoughts. Their thought process was very complicated. Major figures are John Donne, George Herbert, and Andrew Marvell. John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, many are there. Abraham Cowley, Herrick and Carew, Henry Vaughan. Some of the metaphysical poets were religious poets, like George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, and Thomas Traherne. Now, amatory fiction. Have you heard of that? Amatory fiction was a kind of romantic fiction popular around 1660 to 1730. Amatory fiction is romantic fiction, popular from the Restoration. It is notable for preceding the modern novel form. It came before the modern novel, and it produced several female authors. Their works focused on romantic interests, sometimes sex and emotions. Major figures were the fair triumvirate. They are Eliza Haywood, Delarivier Manley, and Aphra Behn. You must have heard of Aphra Behn. He wrote Urunoko, the Royal Slave. They are the fair triumvirate. That means the three women writers. Okay? All right. Next is Restoration comedy. Comedy of manners it is. Comedy of manners flourished from a very early time. Shakespeare also wrote Comedy of Manners. Comedy of manners originated in the Greek comedy of Menander. Later Plautus and Terence. But now in the 17th century, after the Restoration, Comedy of Manners came to be called Restoration comedy. At that time, Comedy of Manners focused on marriage and the game of love. Restoration comedy was aristocratic comedy that focused on marriage and the game of love. Not pure self-love, but the game of love. There would be intrigue and plotting, wit and sparkle of dialogue. These plays were satirical and they dealt with social life and politics. How? Using satire and also the heroic couplet. Restoration comedy was predominantly aristocratic and licentious. They employed aristocratic themes, upper class characters. It was licentious, that means immorality was shown on stage. And it was attacked by Puritans like Jeremy Collier. Major figures of Restoration comedy were William Wycherley, William Congreve, George Etheredge, etc. They were all people from well-off families. They went and lived in France and they wrote all their comedies at a very young age. Wycherley's Country Wife, Congreve's Way of the World, etc. Very important, very famous. Then the sentimental tradition. It is a movement in literature called sentimentalism or sensibility, literature of sensibility we say. It prioritized feeling. Against the Restoration tradition, the sentimental tradition was middle class. It was a middle class phenomenon, a middle class reaction against the Restoration literature and culture. It reflected the emphasis on compassion, on feeling. Feeling, compassion, these were important. There was both novel, sentimental novel and sentimental drama. The sentimental novel or the novel of sensibility is an 18th century literary genre which celebrated the emotional and intellectual concepts of sentiment, sentimentalism and sensibility. There is a slight difference between these terms. The genre influenced drama also, sentimental drama also. Works in this tradition were based on actions and reactions upon emotions and feelings in preference to reason. They gave importance to emotions and feelings instead of reason. The movement was also associated with social causes like abolitionism. Sentimental tradition saw deep, dark passions, social causes, etc. Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, is a major text of this movement. Hannah More, Samuel Richardson, who wrote Pamela, Oliver Goldsmith, who wrote The Vicar of Wakefield, Lawrence Sterne, who wrote A Sentimental Journey, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, all are important figures of the sentimental tradition. Is that clear? Shall we move on? Then the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. It was marked by the increased reverence for logic and disdain for superstition. You remember, this is the Renaissance period, at the end of the Renaissance period. At this time, there was a lot of superstition and religious fighting over religion. The Enlightenment philosophers were against this. They were against religious confusion. They advocated logic, reason, tolerance. The period is marked by the rise of Deism. Deism is a kind of intellectual religion. When God does not come in front of you and you have to know God from your reason itself. This period is marked by Deism, an intellectual backlash against earlier Puritanism. And this was an intellectual backlash. This is more intellectual than emotional. Against Puritanism, it is Deism. And also American Revolution of Independence. American War of Independence was a result of Enlightenment. So was the French Revolution. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau inspired the French Revolution. So who are the major figures? In Germany, we have Immanuel Kant, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and Denis Diderot. Denis Diderot was not in Germany. He was in France. Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau. They were in France. As a part of Enlightenment, we have Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism flourished from the Restoration period till the publication of lyrical ballads. Neoclassicism is a movement in literature and arts based on classical ideals. What are the classical ideals? Classical ideals are order, reason, imitation of classics, and it was also characterized by skepticism or doubt, as well as satire. It was the predominant genre. Importance was given to human nature and wit, and proponents practiced imitation of the classics. Neoclassical writers include the writers of the Restoration period like Dryden, the writers of Augustan age like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, and also the age of Johnson, including Dr. Johnson. The term Neoclassicism originated from the German writer Johann Joachim Winckelmann. Then we have Dryden, Pope, Swift and Johnson, like I already said. Neoclassicism is also called the Augustan age, remember, Augustan age. In Germany at this time, there was Sturm und Drang movement. Sturm und Drang means storm and stress movement. Storm and stress movement. It was following the Enlightenment in Germany, and it was the precursor to the Romantic movement. Sturm und Drang was very emotional movement. It was named after a play by Friedrich Maximilian Klinger. Sturm und Drang literature often features a protagonist who is driven by emotion, impulse, and other motives that run counter to the Enlightenment tradition. Against Enlightenment rationalism, the protagonist is driven by emotion and impulse. The excellent example is Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Goethe and Schiller were the major figures. Then the American Revolution, that's a very important period. 1765, that is the year of the Stamp Act. Up to 1830 is the period of American Revolution roughly. However, 1776 was the year of Declaration of Independence. And it was not only a political and social movement, it was a revolutionary literary movement also. American Revolution was literary. It incorporates both political and literary writings, prose as well as poetry in colonial and early revolutionary America. Major figures were Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, etc. Benjamin Franklin wrote a lot of prose actually. The book Poor Richard's Almanac, that is his famous work. Thomas Paine is the author of the pamphlet Common Sense. It is believed that Thomas Paine's Common Sense started the American Revolution. Thomas Paine also wrote the Rights of Man and the Age of Reason. Rights of Man supported French Revolution. Then Romanticism. Romanticism flourished from the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 till the First Reform Act 1832. Romanticism originated in Germany and then came to America. First England, then America. Romanticism emphasized common life, as you know, emotion, imagination, and freedom of expression. Romanticism is giving importance to rural or common life, emotion, imagination, nature also, and freedom of expression. Major figures are William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, Lord Byron, P.B. Shelley, John Keats. They are the five major romantics. Also Mary Shelley. In France, there was Victor Hugo, etc. Then we have American Romanticism, which is actually different, slightly different from English Romanticism. American Romanticism was predominantly in fiction rather than poetry. However, Transcendentalists wrote some fiction also, poetry also. Unlike English Romanticism, American Romanticism had a strong and sometimes morbid interest in history. They dealt with history a lot. Important figures were Washington Irving. He was the famous short story writer who wrote Rip Van Winkle and Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Then there was Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of Scarlet Letter, The House of Seven Gables. Then there is Ambrose Bierce, later romantic. Then Dark Romanticism. That is also American and it comes within American Romanticism. Dark Romanticism is a 19th century American movement in reaction to Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, was very optimistic. Transcendentalism is the movement of Emerson and Thoreau. I think I did not include Transcendentalism in the presentation, but I'll just teach you now. Transcendentalism is the movement of Emerson and Thoreau. They were stationed in Concord, the place. And Transcendentalism gave importance to nature, learning from nature, human beings as part and parcel of God. They believed in oversoul. They believed in self-reliance of Americans. Americans need not turn to the Europeans anymore, the British anymore. They should be self-reliant. Such ideas. And the Transcendentalists were very optimistic. They believed in human excellence, against which dark romanticism came. They found that man, dark romantics found that man is inherently sinful, self-destructive, and nature is a dark, mysterious force. That is how they believed. The major figures were Edgar Allan Poe, the author of Gothic romances, tales of the grotesque and the arabesque. That is the title of his short story collection. He also wrote poetry like The Raven. Then there is Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote Scarlet Letter, House of the Seven Gables. Remember I told you? The Blithedale Romance. Blithedale Romance was written against Transcendentalism. Edgar Allan Poe called the Transcendentalists Frog Pondians, Koopa Mantugas. Herman Melville was another dark romantic. He wrote Moby Dick and lots of other stories based on seafaring. Edward Arlington Robinson, he was another major writer during this period. Then I come to another movement within Romanticism called Gothic romance or Gothic novel. In fiction, romantic ideals are combined in this genre with an interest in the supernatural and in violence. Gothic romances are set in dungeons and eerie castles, medieval castles, and there will be very violent heroes, women who are victimized, supernatural elements. In England, the tradition was started by Horace Walpole. Also other writers with the Castle of Otranto. Clara Reeve, Anne Radcliffe. Anne Radcliffe is the famous author of Mysteries of Udolpho. Clara Reeve wrote The Old English Baron. Then William Beckford wrote Vathek. Matthew Lewis wrote The Monk. Bram Stoker, wrote Dracula. There are Gothic elements in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, and Edgar Allan Poe is a very important Gothic writer from America. This is the end of the 18th century. Then 19th century, we have in England, the Lake Poets. The Lake Poets came from the Lake District. Lake Esthwaite and such important lakes are there in Lake District. There were 3 romantic poets of Lake District who were called Lake Poets. They wrote about nature and the sublime. They were Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey. They are the Lake Poets. Then the Victorian period. Victorian period is the reign of Queen Victoria. Actually, Queen Victoria reigned from 1837 to 1901. Victorian literature is predominantly the novel. The novel came to prominence. The poets were also there, of course. And authors were showing interest in the harsher aspects of life. Like Charles Dickens, for example. He wrote social realism, showing the sufferings of the working classes. William Makepeace Thackeray, George Eliot, Bronte sisters. They were novelists. Then Alfred Tennyson, Browning and Arnold are poets. Transcendentalism is there. Transcendentalism is the American movement starting from the publication of Nature by Emerson in 1836. American Transcendentalism is a literary movement. It marked a strong interest in nature, learning from nature, and produced poetry and philosophy concerned with self-reliance and independence from modern technology. Major figures are Emerson and Thoreau. However, Walt Whitman was also associated with them. Then the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood came within the Victorian period in England, late 19th century. It's a late 19th century English movement, actually began in 1848. It was based ostensibly on undoing the innovations by the undoing. What did I mean by that? It was based on uh, the innovations by the painter. Undoing, of course. Correct. Undoing because they did not follow Raphael. They went to the period before Raphael. They did not want to follow any aspect of high Renaissance. They thought that Renaissance is treachery. Renaissance realism is treachery. They wanted to go back to the medieval period. Who wanted the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood? They were painters and poets. They drew upon the simplicity, truthfulness, and spirit of devotion in Italian painting before Raphael and the High Renaissance. Before Raphael, there was a certain simplicity, a truthfulness, and spirit of devotion, it seems. Major figures are Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, William Morris, and Christina Rossetti. Most of them were painters, as well as all of them poets. Realism next. Realism is an art movement of the 19th century at the same time as Victorian period, but it originated in France. It was a break with Romanticism. Realism was a break with Romanticism, and it introduced a totally new way of writing by portraying mundane, everyday experiences, depicting familiar people and places and stories, and especially the lower and middle classes. Literary realism tells stories very truthfully in a lifelike manner instead of dramatizing or romanticizing it. So realists had an interest in everyday life and poverty, as well as they were very simple in their perceptions. Realism in art and literature is based on simplification of style and image. Important realists were French, Gustave Flaubert, who wrote Madame Bovary, William Dean Howells is American, Stendhal, French, Red and the Black, he wrote. Honore de Balzac is the author of The Human Comedy, a massive collection of stories and novels. In Russia, there was Leo Tolstoy, who wrote Anna Karenina and War and Peace. Then Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov, etc. Frank Norris, American. Another man is Ikadi Queiroz. Realism gave way to naturalism. Naturalism that flourished in the early 20th century believed that human beings are products of their environment. Naturalism is a philosophical movement in literature. It's more philosophical than literary. Naturalists identified humans as animals. What do you mean by that? Studying their character in relation to their surroundings. In other words, proponents of naturalism believe that heredity and environment, that is the surroundings, control people. Major figures are Émile Zola in France, who wrote Nana, Stephen Crane, who wrote The Red Badge of Courage, Gade Maupassant, who wrote short stories, and Theodore Dreiser in America, who wrote an American tragedy, Sister Carrie, etc. So we have come to the beginning of the 20th century. At this time in Italy, there was a movement called Verismo. Have you heard of Verismo opera? It is a branch of realism and naturalism. It is derivative of naturalism and realism, and it began in post-unification Italy. In Italy, there was a political movement called Risorgimento, or Unification of Italy. Verismo started after that. Verismo literature uses detailed character development based on psychology. Major figures are Giovanni Verga, very important figure, Luigi Capuana. You don't know them because they are Italian. Then socialist realism emerged in Russia in the early 20th century. That means realism that upholds the values of the Socialist Party. Socialist realism is a subset of realist art. It focuses on communist values, socialist values, and realist depiction. The self-expression of the author or distortion of reality, nothing is allowed in socialist realism. The values of the Socialist Party, such as working class people will triumph, the bourgeoisie will be defeated, such ideas only should be there in literature. It developed in the Soviet Union and was imposed as state policy by Stalin. Anybody not practicing socialist realism were punished. Not only Russians, but other people from other socialist countries also partook in the movement. Major figures were Maxim Gorky, Nikolai Ostrovsky, they're all Russian. Mikhail Sholokhov. Remember this man? Do you know this man? Very famous. Sholokhov's and Quiet Flows the Dawn. Then Decadence. That is an late 19th century, early 20th century movement. Decadence. In the mid 19th century, decadence came to refer to moral decay. Moral decay is a value of Hellenistic Greece. After classical Greece came Hellenistic Greece. Decadence came to refer to Hellenistic moral decay. There was a lot of homosexuality and all such unconventional practices in the period of decadence. And such moral decay was attributed as the cause of the fall of great civilizations like the Roman Empire. The generals of Roman Empire became morally decayed. That's why Roman Empire fell, it seems. The movement of decadence was a response to the perceived decadence within the earlier Romantic, Naturalist and Realist movements in France at this time. Decadence was a reaction to the moral decay in the Romantic, Naturalist and Realist movements in France. Clear? In literature of the decadence, literature is taken to an extreme with characters who debase themselves for pleasure, such as our Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. The decadent writers used metaphor, symbolism, and language as tools to obfuscate the truth rather than expose it. Instead of showing the truth, they changed the truth. Major figures are Joris Karl Huysman, Gustave Flaubert, Charles Baudelaire, and Oscar Wilde. Symbolism next. It was a principally French movement of the fin de siècle. Fin de siècle means end of the century. Symbolism is codified by the Symbolist Manifesto of 1886. And Arthur Symonds brought symbolism into England. Symbolism focused on the structure of thought rather than poetic form or image. The external details of poetry is not what is important. Structure of thought is what is important. And many poets were influenced by symbolism. Major figures are Charles Baudelaire, Stéphane Mallarmé, Arthur Rimbaud, Paul Valéry, etc. Symbolism is an avant-garde movement. So is Futurism. Futurism was codified by the Futurist Manifesto of Filippo Marinetti. Futurism avoids being intellectual and it avoids using fixed syntax or style. It makes use of irony, analogy, and is usually written with inspiration or intuition. Major figure is Filippo Marinetti. The Edwardian period in England is the early 20th century in England. Edwardian literature marked a growing division between high and low literature. There was a division between high literature and low literature, as well as between upper class and lower class. That is also there. At this time, there was a growth of children's literature. The predominant style was realism with some modernist elements. Major figures are Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells, John Galsworthy, and Arnold Bennett. Virginia Woolf famously criticized these Edwardian writers as materialists because they focus too much on social reality or material reality. Then there is Georgian poetry. During the time of modernist experimentation, these poets wrote in a simple, traditional style. At that time, modernism was raging. Experimentation was raging. But our Georgian poets wrote in a simple, traditional style using rustic subject matter. They were against the modernists. 5 volumes of their anthology called Georgian Poetry was edited by Edward Marsh. 5 volumes of Georgian poetry was there, edited by Edward Marsh. Did you get that? Now, Major figures were John Masefield, John Drinkwater, Walter Delamere, and Rupert Brooke. John Masefield, John Drinkwater, Walter Delamere, and Rupert Brooke. Next is stream of consciousness, or early 20th century. Stream of consciousness writing negated the centrality of the author. The author is not there speaking all the time. And instead, you see a loosely organized pattern of thought being shared. As it comes to the mind, it is being written. Major figures were Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. You might know that stream of consciousness is originally a psychological term that came from William James, who wrote Principles of Psychology. Stream of consciousness was first carried out in France by Edward Dujardin. Edouard Dujardin. Edward Dujardin. In England, it was Dorothy Richardson who first used it. Also Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. Then modernism. You know that in literature, visual art, architecture, music, everywhere modernism flourished. Modernism denoted a break with the tradition and past to explore new forms of expression. Modernism was a reaction to the World War, and it was a very varied movement incorporating different styles as well as reactions to science and technology that was growing at that time. Urban culture was growing, science and technology was growing at this time. And modernism was a rebellion. Modernism involved a rebellion against the traditional moral and social conventions, and also a creation of new artistic forms and idioms. Modernism had its own style of art and idioms. They regarded reality as multiple and subjective. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Hilda Doolittle, James Joyce, Gertrude Stein in America, Nat Hampson, Fernando Pessoa, very important writers, Marcel Proust, Thomas Mann, so many modernists. Then Expressionism. Expressionism was also part of the larger avant-garde movement. Literary Expressionism is there. Expressionism is there in drama also. It originated in Germany. And Expressionism rejected realism in order to depict emotions and subjective thoughts. Anti-realistic it is. It delves into mind, human mind. It is Freudian. Important figures are Franz Kafka, Alfred Doblin, Gottfried Benn, etc. Imagism, another avant-garde movement associated with modernism. Poetry, that is imagist, is based on a single concrete image rather than elaborate description. And it is based on the motto, the natural object is always the adequate symbol. Best example will be William Carlos Williams's The Red Wheelbarrow. There are three tenets of Imagism as put forward by Ezra Pound. The direct treatment of the thing, that is what is important. Secondly, there should be no word that is unnecessary and that does not contribute to the representation. No description at all. Lastly, they advocated natural rhythm of the musical phrase. Music should come from the language itself. There should be no artificial rhythm. Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle or H.D., Amy Lovell, Richard Aldington, etc. important figures. Another avant-garde movement is Dadaism. It was projected by its proponents as anti-art. Dadaism was considered by themselves, Dadais themselves as anti-art, focused on going against artistic norms and conventions. Major figures are Tristan Tzara, who gave rise to the movement in Zurich around 1915 as against traditional and capitalist aesthetics. Marcel Duchamp, Hugo Ball, André Breton, important figures. André Breton also appears in Surrealism. Surrealism, another avant-garde movement from France, influenced by painting, and uses surprising images and transitions to play off formal expectations and depict the unconscious rather than the conscious mind. It employs disruption of forms and colors. Surrealists include Jean Cocteau. Many of them were filmmakers also. Andre Breton, see here also. Salvador Dali. Then Stridentism. Have you heard of that? Stridentism is a Mexican avant-garde movement in art. They exalted modern urban life and social revolution. We have not heard these names, but you can look at them. Next is poets of the First World War. They were British poets who documented both the idealism and the horrors of the war. Some people at first, like Rupert Brooke, talked about the patriotism and idealism of the war. Later writers like Wilfred Owen talked about the pity and horror of the war. Siegfried Sassoon, Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen. Harlem Renaissance, 1920s. It happened in the early 20th century in the place called Harlem near New York. At that time, African Americans were faced with racial segregation and discrimination. There were less economic opportunities for them, even though they were free. There was a lot of violence against the African Americans, etc. So many African Americans from the South began to move north towards freedom. And they settled in Harlem, and they began to express a new pride in being Negro. In the 1920s it happened. It was a strong literary movement leading to an assertion of a positive black identity. And the name New Negro movement also was applied based on Alain Locke's anthology called The New Negro. Major figures were Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay. Then the lost generation. They came immediately after the First World War, before the Second World War. It was originally a term used by Gertrude Stein, and it was later popularized by the lost generation writer Ernest Hemingway. In the epigraph to his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, the epigraph reads, "You are all a lost generation." Later in Hemingway's memoir, A Movable Feast, also this word appears. It refers to the group of American literary personalities who lived in Paris and other parts of Europe from the end of the World War to the beginning of Great Depression in the 1930s. There was a stock market crash in 1929. Major figures: F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway, Ezra Pound, Waldo Pierce, John Dos Passos, etc. Southern agrarians were a group of critics and poets. They were from Vanderbilt University in America. They expressly rejected or repudiated many modernist developments. Because they were from the American South, they rejected modernism to a large extent in favor of metrical verse and narrative, because they were conservative, comparatively conservative. And some Southern agrarians were also associated with New Criticism. Only some of them. And those figures supported modernism. Major figures were John Crowe Ransom and Robert Penn Warren. Then poets of the 1930s. The Auden group, they are called. These were children of the First World War. They were disconcerted by war and communalism, by the class struggle, and they had a passionate belief in social responsibility of poets. These poets were classical in outlook, but did not engage in experimentation like the modernists. They had leftist leanings. They were called pink poets because they were partly communist, and they were all educated at Oxford. Auden, Stephen Spender, Cecil Day Lewis, important figures. Louis MacNeice, Christopher Isherwood. Then the New Apocalypse movement, that is 1940s. They are neo-romantic poets. They were against the classical poets of the 30s. Instead of classicism, they rejected classicism. They wrote with intense imaginative subjectivity. The movement got its name from the anthology The New Apocalypse, edited by Henry Trees and J.F. Henry. The White Horseman and The Crown and the Sickle were two later anthologies. Major figures were Dylan Thomas and Norman McCaig. Got it? Are you bored? If you are bored, you can pause the video and do something else and come back, but I will continue. The 1950s poets in Britain were the movement poets. These poets employed a rational, empirical, and argumentative tone. They did not write like the new apocalypse writers. They were very rational. They believed in experience, argumentative tone. And they did not experiment. Like the modernists, they did not experiment. They wrote traditional syntax and ordinary diction. This made their poetry colloquial in style. The movement poets had two anthologies. Poets of the 50s, edited by D.J. Enright. It was published in Japan. And New Lines, edited by Robert Conquest. Philip Larkin, Tom Gunn, Elizabeth Jennings. Movement poets. Angry Young Man movement was a group of mostly working class and middle class British playwrights and novelists. They became prominent in the 1950s. They were disillusioned with the post-war reforms of England. They were the disillusioned post-war generation. They expressed impatience and resentment at the hypocrisy and mediocrity of the upper and middle classes. They were angry. Major figures: John Osborne, who wrote Look Back in Anger; Alan Sillitoe, who wrote Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner; Kingsley Amis, who wrote Lucky Jim; John Wayne, John Brain, Arnold Wesker. This Arnold Wesker is also associated with kitchen sink drama. This was a British cultural movement that developed from the Angry Young Man movement. This was even more insightful of working class life. It was found in theatre, art, novels, films. They depicted even more squalor and discontentment with modern society. Important figures are Arnold Wesker, who wrote the trilogy of plays, Chicken Soup with Barley, Roots, and I Am Talking About Jerusalem. Then there was Sheila Delaney, who wrote A Taste of Honey. The Beat generation, or the Beatniks. They are a very anti-establishment group of the 1950s and 60s. They employed they employed the values of sensibility, looseness of form, rejection of rigid conventions and rules of language, rejection of academic principles or constraints, all sorts of liberation. And they were primarily poets. It was a counterculture and youth culture movement beginning in the 1950s. They rejected materialism and capitalism. They were against war, against bourgeois social values and formalism. They had unconventional views of sexuality and interracial relations. And they were inspired by Buddhism and Eastern spirituality. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Ken Kesey, Gregory Corso, important figures. The Jindy Vorobak movement, you're wondering what that is. It's an Australian Aboriginal movement, originated in Adelaide in South Australia during the Great Depression. It sought to preserve uniquely Australian culture from external influence. It wanted to preserve uniquely Australian culture from external influence. How? By incorporating Australian Aboriginal languages and mythology and unique Australian settings. Wow. Important figures: Rex Ingemels and Xavier Herbert. Remember this name. Next is Agitprop theatre. Agitprop theatre was a highly politicized theatre that flourished in Europe and United States also, Russia, Germany. And agitation propaganda. Agitprop is a portmanteau word made from agitation propaganda. It was coined in 1938, I think. Highly politicized working class theatre that developed in Russia and Germany. And it was a mobile form of exhortative and revolutionary theatre designed for quick outdoor performance. Major figures are Bertolt Brecht and Joan Littlewood, who is associated with Theatre Workshop, a working class movement. Next is Theatre of Cruelty, associated with Antonin Artaud, the author of Theatre and its Double. This movement can be seen as a break from traditional Western theatre. and it is a means by which artists assault the senses of the audience. It provides a sensory assault. Techniques of visual poetry was used, such as mime, gestures, physical theatre and dance. Rather than words, these were used. Creating a dream world with the use of rituals, masks, traditions, and striking costumes. They were influenced by Bali, the place. Major figures were Antonin Artaud, Peter Brook, Samuel Beckett, and Jean Genet. Then there is postmodernism. You might know that postmodernism is also a very broad movement in literature and arts. And generally speaking, postmodernism involves a self-reflexive playfulness, self-awareness, or the awareness that there is no reality. It is characterized by skepticism, subjectivism, relativism, etc. A general rejection of reason, and an acute awareness of how ideology maintains political and economic power. Postmodernism is a literary movement embracing diversity, wordplay, and other attributes of modern literature. Important themes of postmodernism are paranoia, hyperreality, intertextuality, magic realism, distortion of time or breaking up of chronology, themes of paranoia and unpredictability, etc. Major figures are Jorge Luis Borges, Salman Rushdie, Thomas Pynchon. Absurdism is related to existentialism. I have not dealt with existentialism separately. Absurdist movement is derived from absurdist philosophy, which is related to existentialism, where man is alienated from this world. And it argues that life is inherently purposeless, and it questions truth and value. As such, absurdist literature often includes dark humor, satire, and incongruity. It looks at life as irrational and comical and uses non sequitur dialogues, violation of causality, unpredictable juxtapositions, and violence. Jean-Paul Sartre spelling is wrong. Samuel Beckett, Albert Camus, Gao Xinjian, very important figures. Then confessional poetry. Poetry that often brutally exposes the self. Whatever is considered taboo, like sexuality, psychological disorder, etc., are brutally exposed. And as part of an aesthetic of the beauty and power of human frailty. The confessional poets give expression to human frailty. Major figures are Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Alicia Ostraker. Magic realism is associated with postmodernism. It's a literary movement where magical elements appear in otherwise realistic circumstances. Magic and realism are combined. Most often it is associated with Latin American literary boom of the 20th century. Latin America was the place where it began. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Octavio Paz, Gunther Grass, that is German. Octavio Paz is Italian. Julio Cortázar, Sadegh Hedayat, Malay Roy Chowdhury, Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, Ben Okri, Salman Rushdie, then Angela Carter. Post-colonialism, as everybody knows, is a diverse, loosely connected movement of writers from former colonies of Europe. Their work is frequently politically charged. Techniques include appropriation of colonial languages, questioning of colonial meta-narratives, deconstruction of the colonial discourse, writers engaging in rewriting history, presenting decolonization and decanonization, themes of nationhood, nationalism, cultural plurality, etc. Major figures: Jamaica Kincaid, who wrote Annie John, The Autobiography of My Mother, Lucy. V.S. Naipaul, who wrote Mimic Men, A House for Mr. Biswas. Derek Walcott, Dream on Monkey Mountain. Salman Rushdie, Midnight Children. Giannina Braschi, Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe. Nigerian writers. Then there is Black Arts movement. It's not about protest literature, but it's about creating a new black aesthetic. Black Arts movement creates a new black aesthetic. It is the aesthetic arm of the Black Power movement. It is generally considered to have been launched by Amiri Baraka. 1960s. Amiri Baraka, Gwendolyn Brooks, Nikki Giovanni, etc. Sonia Sanchez, etc. Important figures. Spoken word poetry was a postmodern literary movement where writers used their speaking voice to present fiction, poetry, monologues, I should say spoken word, and remove poetry because it's mainly poetry, but it is also in other genres. It arises from beat poetry, Harlem Renaissance, mostly American. The textual origins differ and may have been written for print initially, then read aloud for audiences. Spoken word gave rise to performance poetry and slam poetry. Spalding Gray, have you heard these names? This name I already mentioned. New York School of Poetry is a group of urban, gay or gay-friendly leftist poets and writers and painters of the 1960s. Major figures are Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery. So I have stopped there. I have not come to the 21st century. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please read extra, read more. Thank you.